So now our third featured speaker, Nazila Fathi, is a former New York Times correspondent. She worked out of Tehran for most of the last decade, from 2001 to 2009. She reported from Tehran on human rights as well as other political and cultural issues. She was forced to leave Iran in 2009 in the aftermath of the elections there, when the government started to crack down on foreign media and expelled a lot of Nazila and her colleagues from the country. She relocated in Toronto, and now she's based out of Massachusetts. She's a fellow at Harvard. She's here today to discuss some of her insights from her experience on the ground in Iran, to discuss the human rights situation and some of the approaches that can be productive to addressing that situation. So we're very pleased to have Nazila with us today. Please give her a warm round of applause.
Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with you. I have enjoyed the talk so much so far. I have the same message for you as everybody else here, which might be a good thing, I don't know. But it seems that the human rights situation in Iran is deteriorating dramatically. According to account by International Campaign for Human Rights, Iran executed 542 people in 2010. Compare this number to 94 in 2005, before President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad came to office. Only within the first 2 months of this year, January and February, another 150 people have been executed. That means that if the authorities continue with the same pace, close to 1,000 people will be executed by the end of this year. The numbers are just alarming. And unfortunately, it reminds many people of the executions that took place in 1988. Close to 4,000 people, political prisoners, many of whom had been tried and were sentenced to jail terms, were suddenly executed within a period of 5 months. Despite people's religious, political beliefs, human rights should be a principle. And many people are alarmed these days that because of the scale of violence, the government may resort to same measure. The authorities managed to keep the killings of 1988 secret for a long time. Word leaked out only after survivors got out of prison. And then the authorities justified that the country's western border had come under attack by Mujahedin organization. But 21 years later, last year in 2009, the regime was faced with a much greater threat. Hundreds of thousands of people marched on the streets for over 6 months. Since then, we know that thousands of people have been jailed. Again, according to International Campaign for Human Rights, in Mashhad, in Bakirabad prison, people are taken in groups of 50 or 60 to be executed without any official acknowledgement. Sources have told the group that the death certificate for many of the people who are to be executed are even issued before they are taken to the gallows. Many of these people are charged with drug-related crimes. Many of them are accused of being smugglers or or people who have been in possession of huge amounts of drug. But in a country where one out of every 7 people are drug addicts, and I'm not talking about people who use drugs occasionally. According to government figure, some 10 million people are drug addicts. This is quite a harsh punishment. In addition to that, it seems that the government is accusing many of the political prisoners with possession of drugs or drug-related charges. Zahra Bahrami, who was executed in January, was a woman who was arrested during the protests last year. But she was executed on the grounds that she had in possession a huge amount of drugs. Another 2 political prisoners were executed in January. 3 other protesters from 2009 are on the death row. Currently, there are 1,000 political prisoners in jail. 500 of them have been tried. Another 500 have been kept in a limbo. The stories that we hear of those who are released, stories of physical and psychological torture, are just horrifying. Lawyers who defend these prisoners, they have been faced with risks as well. Nasrin Sotoudeh is one of these lawyers who has been in solitary confinement since September. And then the Iranian government has taken advantage of the international attention that has been given to Libya and Egypt, and amidst the protests in the region, it has gone after the opposition leaders, Mr. Mousavi and his wife, along with Mehdi Karoubi and his wife. They have both disappeared since February 14th. There are unofficial reports that they've been taken to a prison called Hishmatiyeh in Tehran, or that they've been transferred to safe houses. This has been of a great concern because safe houses have historically been used for leaders who had a wide social support, and these leaders were taken to these houses to silence them. The houses were even acknowledged in 2000 by Iranian authorities when dissidents were murdered. And we're talking about a regime that has gone even after its own commanders. Last year, during the protests, authorities arrested the son of a senior Revolutionary Guard commander, Mohsen Ruhollah Amini, who was tortured to death. And his gruesome murder seemed to be a message that was sent to the commanders who were disillusioned with the current system and might be tempted to turn their back against the regime. What's happening in Iran is even more significant now, with the tremors of what has happened in Tunisia and in Egypt. It seems that Iranian people do not want to fall behind from the race for freedom. In the meantime, the world was unwilling to look at the suppression that many of these governments were engaged in until just recently, when these people have risen and have demanded change. But we cannot expect people who have been treated with violence for years to foster civil society and democracies. It is very natural for human societies to turn to violence at times like this, when the regimes are just treating any kind of protest with utter violence. Just look at Libya, the case of Libya. Protesters who we were calling them pro-democracy protesters a month ago are now called rebels. In Iran, we have a similar situation, but there is a remnant of civil society that is left. Every single death counts because they fuel dissent, anger, and revenge. We need help. Iranian people need help to protect what is left of their limping civil society. The Mourning Mothers in Iran, a group that aligned itself with the Green Movement, are mostly comprised of mothers who lost their children in 1988. It has been a very peaceful group that has been demanding the release of political prisoners. But without attention, without help to such peaceful groups, these groups are going to be sidelined, and more violent groups that might be willing to go to extraordinary lengths to bring change come to power. The structure of power in Iran is much more complicated than the structure of power in Libya, Tunisia, or Egypt, where one leader was in charge. In Iran, power has been divided among various institutions. Different circles that are close to Ayatollah Khamenei, who seems to be the man in charge, have been participating in the decision makings that have led to the current situation. Groups of the Revolutionary Guards, a circle of aides to Mr. Khamenei, as well as a section of the judiciary, they have all been involved and contributed to the decisions. So international pressure needs to be put on a large scale of figures within the Iranian government. For a long time, it was widely believed that with a kind of revolutionary information revolution that had taken place, and the way Iranian people had empowered themselves to disseminate information about violation of human rights, to inform the outside world about what was happening inside the country and to embarrass the government, they were capable of preventing the kind of violence that had happened before. But unfortunately, it seems that the Iranian regime is trying very hard to create a kind of information blackout, and it has been successful so far. Since last year, the government has very efficiently slowed internet to a crawl so that people have not been able to post as many videos and photos that they used to post before 2009 and during the earlier months after the protest. Mobile services and text messaging services are regularly shut down on the days that protests are planned. The government has successfully jammed satellite television, which has been a very efficient tool to inform people in various parts of the country. Many parts of the country you would travel and see satellite dishes sprouting from people's rooftops, and it had become a major way for people to get information about what was happening in the capital, what was happening in other cities. I was talking to journalists in Tehran just yesterday, and they were saying that reporters are even banned to use the term the Green Movement, which was the biggest upheaval in Iran's modern history when hundreds of thousands of people poured onto the streets. The pressure is so much that many are quitting their jobs, many have left the country since last year, and many are even trying to do other works other than journalism. As a reporter in Tehran, I can testify that international pressure does work. I saw it firsthand because we were constantly pressured not to report cases of human rights violation. I was constantly reminded that I should not report the number of the executions that took place. Prisoners always indicated a certain time in prison when pressure was lifted on them, and it turned out to coincide with the time when their cases were publicized, when international community was issuing statements in their support. And the most recent case has been the case of Sakina Ashtiani, the woman who was sentenced to be stoned to death last year. And after international pressure culminated, the Iranian government had to back down from carrying out the sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that a human rights envoy to monitor events on the ground in Iran might be on its way, but that is not enough. The Iranian government needs to be pressured. International pressure has to increase in various forms, statements, condemnations, naming and shaming individuals who are involved in the decision makings that have led to the violence so far. The fears are very serious. The scale of violence has dramatically increased. Human rights has been a principle in the foreign policy of the United States. It is very important to make it a global issue. Thank you. Sure.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. Please just state your name and your affiliation. Does anybody have any questions? Shrita?
Nazila, thank you so much. Over the course of the last 2 years, we have seen how there seems to have been some shifts in the viewpoints, at least of the grassroots of the Green Movement, but also to a certain extent, some of its former leaders, as to what they expect the international community to do, what they expect the international community not to do, and perhaps more importantly, the posture that they view would be helpful if the US adopted, and the postures that they perhaps would not view to be particularly helpful. Could you give us your assessment of what it is that you are hearing from people on the ground, as well as from people that are perhaps a little bit higher up in the organization of the opposition? What are the things that they expect, and what are the things that they fear from the US and the international community?
Well, Chita, it is very hard to expect from the opposition leaders, Mr. Mousavi or Karoubi, to come out and say bluntly, yes, they want international support. They want support from the United States. Of course, they would never say that, because the minute they say that, they would be accused of cooperating with, quote unquote, the enemy of the country. But people on the ground always said that they wanted their message to be conveyed to the outside world. They always said that they needed at least the verbal support of the international community and the United States. We're talking about a government that is armed to its teeth, and it has gone to extraordinary lengths to protect itself. When it comes to human rights, it's not an issue that concerns any political group. So I don't see why not only the United States, but the international community would come out and condemn the suppression of pro-democracy, peaceful demonstrators on the streets. For a whole week, Iranians demonstrated in silence. There was no violence. And the violence first started by the government. The warning first came from the government that it would engage in a bloodbath, in fact. So it is very obvious that any kind of international support, even verbal, would matter to the Iranian people. At least it would give them confidence. And in some other cases, as in Egypt, we've seen that it works. It puts pressure on the leaders.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin Tu, an independent analyst. Could you say, to put this in context a little bit, about the frequency of stoning in Iran in recent years and at present?
Well, stoning is in the Iranian Penal Code. It has been there since the revolution. There has been many verdicts that have been issued based on this law. But we don't hear about it. They are not officially announced, or at least since Mr. Shahrudi left. The last official statement that we had, the former head of the judiciary, Mr. Shahrudi, said that he didn't want the sentence to be carried out. He wanted to see other forms of punishment to replace that. But it is in the law. So that means the judges have to rule based on that law. The last official verdict that was issued was for Sakina Ashtiani. If there are any others, and if they are being carried out in other cities, in smaller cities, which is very, very possible, because sometimes people take these kinds of things, especially in the most remote areas, in their own hands. We don't hear about them. They're not officially announced.
Any questions from the audience?
Nazila, do you have any thoughts on U.S.-Iran policy in terms of U.S. engagement with Iran. After the elections in 2009, there was this, I think, solid body of opinion within Iran who said that, or thought that, if the United States were to engage Iran in the immediate aftermath of a fraudulent election, that would legitimize Ahmadinejad, that would, give the regime a greater staying power. But now that we're about a year and a half after, that event, what are your views on how the United States should proceed, or whether establishing diplomatic relations with Iran would be a good thing, or whether that would undermine the struggle for democracy in Iran?
Well, engagement is always a good idea, because as long as things are talked through, as long as there's a dialogue, there's a possibility for the situation to move forward. What happened last year was that there was a wide assumption that the focus of engagement was going to be the nuclear policy. And it was felt that because the Iranian government felt it was weakened because of the protests, it might have compromised over its nuclear plans. And then in that case, engagement would have given legitimacy to Mr. Ahmadinejad, who was not considered as a legitimate president by people inside the country. Engagement is a good idea as long as all issues and all topics are discussed, especially now when human rights situation has reached to the point where people are being executed in huge numbers and the government is not even acknowledging. So these issues should be discussed. The government should be pressured over its behavior towards its treatment of its citizens, and it should be held accountable.
Thanks, Dochi, for the Democracy Coalition Project. You mentioned, and I think another audience member talked about a lack of clarity by opposition leaders on what they need from the international community. I think there's also a lack of clarity on what their vision for the future of Iran is. They talk a lot about what they're against, but I'm not sure they've articulated a clear vision for a different future. And I think there's a lot of discussion on the blogs and in the Iranian blogosphere on are you a reformist? What does a reformist mean anymore? Do the opposition leaders actually support the current constitutional framework? Are they for change? So there's a lack of clarity, I think. My first question is, why is there this lack of clarity? And second, how can the international community continue to progressively address the human rights situation and the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people when there's a lack of clarity, not just for the Iranian people, but for the international community of what's coming next?
You are absolutely right. There is a lack of clarity, and that is because there's a lack of agenda. There's a lack of leadership. Mr. Karoubi and Mr. Mousavi just turned out to be the lucky leaders of this movement. I think we have to be clear on one thing. What happened after the 2009 elections was not a planned demonstration, was very much spontaneous. It was very much a result of the anger and frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface for many years, that suddenly translated itself into a demand for the nullification of the election results, partly because people felt they felt their intelligence had been insulted. It was not something that they were expecting. They had put up with everything, but they looked forward to that little window of freedom that they had, that they could make a choice between the bad and the worse. Not that they had a free hand to participate in democratic elections. And it appeared that agreement had been breached by the government, and that angered people. And people came out on the streets in such great numbers. And even like for months after the election, I remember I spoke to leaders, smaller leaders on the streets, and none of them were saying that they were seeking to overthrow the regime. Even the ones who were much more radical, none of them had a plan for immediate overthrowing of the regime. The Green Movement appeared to be an umbrella for various kinds of opposition groups who wanted different things, from overthrowing the regime to just reforming the current system and bringing fundamental changes. So, as you said, there's a lack of clarity, there's a lack of agenda, there's a lack of leadership, and the situation has become even worse because people have lost their ability to communicate, their way of networking and informing one another. They don't have access to internet anymore. They don't have access to satellite TV. And satellite TV is important because there were programs on channels that were calling for overthrowing to the regime, to the, for example, the Persian language BBC that was trying to offer an independent analysis of what was going on the ground. And this brought people together. It gave access to people to information. And when people have information, they can make wiser choices. Now they have been crippled. They don't have any of that. If the Western society wants to help, if the United States wants to help, the first thing that they need is access to free internet, lift the sanctions. Iranians cannot even buy Skype credits to talk on Skype lines. They have to rely on telephone lines that are monitored by the Iranian government. There is satellite internet over Iran, but because of the sanctions, they cannot access it.
Hello, I'm Sherveen from the State Department. I was just curious that since you've actually spent time and based on your sense of speaking with people, how much traction does the MEK have inside? There's a certain decibel number here, and how much is it support-wise inside?
Not much. Not much, absolutely not much. This is a very grassroots movement in Iran. It's quite peaceful. It's nonviolent. I mean, the presence of women is a good example of that. I mean, when you see such large number of women, even coming out on the streets when the confrontation erupted, and trying to protect both sides, both the protesters and some of the pro-government forces who were sometimes falling off their motorcycles. That shows, that's a testimony how peaceful this movement is. But the bloodshed from 1988 is very much remembered. I mean, everybody remembers somebody, a family member, who had been executed or had spent time in prison. Nobody wants to see that kind of bloodshed anymore.
So much, Nazila John, for all the work you've done since you've been in Iran, and the work that you continue to do here in the United States about Iran. My question is, you are well aware of the inner workings of the regime. You're also in touch with people inside Iran. There are two prevailing ideas here in the West and in America about what might happen with this movement. The first theory is that, a lot of protesters might suddenly come out one day, millions might march, and they would suddenly, topple the government, by force. And the second theory is that the pressure by all these protests and, outside support, some outside support, is going to make the regime implode from the inside. Sort of like a coup would occur, and there would be some reforms, and, slowly things would turn to, become more democratic, and there would be more human rights. What is your idea? What do you think the opposition movement is aiming for at this moment?
It would be a mistake to predict anything for any country, especially Iran, because it's been a completely unpredictable place. I remember even like 2 months before the election, I was telling my editors that I didn't think people would come out to vote. I thought that Ahmadinejad would mobilize his supporters, about 10-15 million people, and would have an easy victory, but I was wrong. Within a couple of weeks, the whole country turned upside down. But there are three scenarios for Iran. I mean, the best one and the most optimistic one is that to believe that the pressure from below and the divisions within the establishment would cause a crack, and eventually the establishment would be forced to make some compromises and to begin some kind of fundamental reform. Unfortunately, there is no sign so far that this is going to happen. People who are in power right now seem to be very, very obedient to the supreme leader. Any kind of differences that there has emerged so far has been silenced immediately. The second scenario, as you suggested, is some kind of eruption and institutional breakdown. I personally have no doubt that if the Iranian regime does not compromise, does not make fundamental changes to give more social, political freedoms, the crowds of hundreds of thousands will just increase, because I saw that in 1999 there were 10,000 people, 15,000 people who were demonstrating, and we thought they were huge numbers. In 2009 there were hundreds of thousands. The government acknowledged at one point that there were more than 3 million people out on the streets. Last week, when everybody was predicting that people would not come out again, people were coming out in huge numbers. The thing was that they didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go. They were faced with brutal forces who are clubbing down. But the third thing that I know for sure is that Iranians fear institutional breakdown. Iranians do not want what happened in Egypt. They were very happy that Mubarak left, but if you look at the analysis that was offered, everybody was comparing Egypt with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which is too simplistic to do that. It's a different time, the circumstances were different, and it was a big victory in Egypt, but they just do not want to go that far. The memories of bloodshed of the early days of the revolution, and then the war, and then the era where the country, after the war, it started putting itself together, are still very alive in the minds of most majority of people. So the reason we see that lack of agenda, that lack of planning, is because they don't want to go that far. They don't want to see they want to keep the current order and then bring change. And that is the tricky part.
Hi, I'm Farah Zaghomi. I work with Senator Cantwell out of Washington State. I had a quick question while you were in Iran, specifically about the young people there and how they were dealing with this. Like here in the U.S., we have shows like The Daily Show, The Colbert Report that break down the news in a comedic way, and we sort of have ways to deal with sort of what's going on with the world. And in Iran, with the young people, leading up to the 2009 protests, and then even after that, what's their way of sort of coping with what's going on? Do they have like underground meetings, or do they turn to music? Do they turn to, like, what sort of outlets do they have to deal with what they want to accomplish, but in a more escapist way, as opposed to just, you know, protesting and uprising? How do they deal with being held back?
Well, Iranian society is a very dynamic society. Even when people get very depressed, they still have their indoor circle of friends. They get together behind closed doors. And we've seen how the Iranian cultural scene has flourished in the past 10 years or 20 years. You're faced with all these Iranian artists, filmmakers, painters, musicians, who have all developed their skills behind closed doors. So it's not that people are politically depressed now, and so they're not doing anything. The majority of people are continuing with their lives. It's when that level of frustration and anger, when it reaches a certain point, that they suddenly pour out on the streets. We're not talking about not only a generation, we're not talking about people who are willing to come out and get killed for freedom. Those days are over in Iran. I mean, in 1979, perhaps the whole idea of martyrdom and getting killed for the sake of future was something that people believed in. These days, nobody does, not at least the young people that you and I are thinking about. Perhaps it's what's in the minds of pro-government forces, but young people, they come out and demonstrate because they want a better life, because they want more social and political. And I would stress that they want more social freedom more than political. A lot of people don't care about politics. It was a suppression of the past 5 years under Mr. Ahmadinejad that really reached people to that point to come out in such huge numbers.
Okay, we have time for about 2 more questions. Go over here in the corner.
Krovan, I'm the author of the novel Azadi, Protest in the Streets of Tehran. My question to you is, how do you think the Rafsanjani situation is going to impact the regime? Is it important, or is he just going to be set aside? Which would not be like Rafsanjani to let himself be set aside.
I think that was one of the big historical changes in Iran just last week when he was officially sidelined. It definitely marks a big change in the Iranian politics. This is the first time that one of the founders, one of the most instrumental figures of the Iranian revolution has been completely sidelined. But this is a man who still has influence within the Revolutionary Guards. He was the man who was the commander-in-chief during the 8 years of war. It's true that many of those people who support him within the Revolutionary Guards are older commanders who might not be in power anymore. But the Revolutionary Guards is also a big entity, and not all of them are with Mr. Ahmadinejad, and Mr. Rafsanjani has immense influence among the traditional clerics in Qom. He might be the only official cleric in the government who is so influential among the clerics in Qom. He's politically respected, and his conduct in the past 3 decades has been something that many clerics relied on. So if there is a time, if he wants to rely on these 2 supports, he has the leverage. But for the time being, he has been very much sidelined.
One more question?
We all know that foreign reporters were expelled from Iran following the elections. I was wondering if you have seen any signs of a reopening in the political scene in Iran, any signs that foreign reporters, media will be once again allowed to return to the country?
You know, foreign reporters might be given visas to go into the country for a week, and they might be allowed to travel with minders. I don't think that's important. I think what is important is to see the ones who are based in the country, how much freedom they have. And last week was a good example of that. Many press credentials were removed. So a lot of people who were working were not allowed to go out on the streets. The ones who kept their press cards, they were warned not to leave their offices or their homes. One of them, a British correspondent with AFP who defied the ban and went out, he was immediately expelled.